quickly
Sergeant Rick
become
Goff met his
inseparable.
wife, Susan, over 20 years
Chris
ago,
takes
and
Karen's
together they've built their
firstborn
life.
child.
The girl got out of the car, and my dad's cousin went and put her back in the car.
Frozen.
What's the cousin's
She was
name?
crying.
And now the question remains, if she's not with her kidnapper, then where is she?
A 21-year-old mother vanished from her home in broad daylight. When police arrived, they found her 2 young children, ages 2 and 6 months, alone and screaming. No sign of struggle, no witnesses, no idea where she'd gone. But then 911 received a call from the missing woman herself. And what she said, while her kidnapper sat inches away, would become the most crucial evidence in the case. To understand how Denise Lee managed to solve her own murder, we need to go back to the beginning. January 17th, 2008. The morning Denise Amber Lee called her mother for the last time. She was 21 years old, a young mother moving through the routines that fill the hours before lunch. Her 2-year-old son Noah played on the living room floor of their Charlotte County home, stacking blocks and knocking them down with the kind of focused chaos only toddlers possess. 6-month-old Adam sat propped in his bouncer, his attention fixed on his mother's face as she moved through the kitchen. The morning was warm, even for January in Florida. Sunlight filtered through the windows, catching the dust motes that hung suspended in the air. Denise picked up the phone and dialed her mother, a habit as ordinary as brewing coffee, as unremarkable as breathing. They talked about the boys, about nothing important, about the small details that fill a Thursday when you're home with 2 children under 3. Noah's newest words. Adam's emerging teeth. Plans for the weekend, maybe. The kind of conversation you forget the moment it ends, because you assume there will be 100 more just like it. Denise hung up and returned to the rhythm of her day. She fed Adam, changed him, settled him for his morning nap. She played with Noah, read him a picture book, watched him run circles around the coffee table with the boundless energy of a 2-year-old who doesn't yet understand that the world can be anything other than safe. She was patient with him, attentive. She was doing what mothers do, holding the center, keeping the small world of her home running smoothly, unremarkably, predictably. There was no warning, no moment where the air shifted, no sudden chill, no feeling that something was wrong. How does the last ordinary moment feel when you don't know it's the last? It feels like every other moment. It feels like a Thursday morning in January with children who need you, with a phone call to your mother that ends the way it always does, with plans for later and tomorrow and next week. It feels like the beginning of a day, not the end of everything. Denise moved through her house, the same house where she and her husband Nathan had built their young family, where Noah had taken his first steps, where Adam had been brought home from the hospital just months before. She didn't lock the doors. Why would she? It was mid-morning in a quiet neighborhood. She was home. She was safe. She had no reason to think otherwise. By 3:30 that afternoon, Nathan would walk through that same door and find the house unbearably hot. The air conditioning had been shut off. The children would be crying. Noah, frightened and confused. Adam, screaming with the desperation of an infant left too long without comfort. And Denise would be gone. Not out running errands, not visiting a friend, just gone. As if she'd been erased from the middle of her own life. But first, there was her father, the man who had spent years teaching her exactly what to do if she was ever in danger. Rick Goff picked up the phone expecting an invitation to dinner. He was a veteran Charlotte County Sheriff's deputy, an expert fugitive tracker who'd spent decades hunting people who didn't want to be found. But when his daughter called in the middle of a Thursday afternoon, it was usually about the boys or weekend plans. Routine, family. But it wasn't Denise calling. It was Nathan Lee, her husband. And his voice had the kind of tightness that makes a cop's instincts go cold. I opened the door, and the first thing I noticed was the heat, Nathan said. She's not there, and I don't know where she is. Rick's hand tightened on the phone. What do you mean she's not there? I came home at 3:30. The air conditioning was shut off. The house was like an oven. Noah was crying in the bedroom. Adam was in his crib. And Denise, she's just gone. Her purse is here. Her car's here. She's not. Rick had trained Denise for this. Not casually, he'd taught her deliberately what to do if she was ever in danger, how to leave clues, how to stay calm, how to give investigators something to work with if the worst ever happened. It was the kind of training a father who sees too much gives his daughter, hoping she'll never need it. He'd taught her to think like a cop, to understand evidence, to know what mattered. She'd grown up watching him track fugitives, absorbing the logic of pursuit and survival. She knew how investigations worked. She knew what details would matter later. "Are the boys hurt?" Rick asked. "No, they're okay. Just scared." But Rick, she wouldn't leave them like this. Not alone. Not with the house that hot. No, she wouldn't. Rick knew that with certainty that doesn't require thought. Denise was a young mother, responsible and attentive. She didn't leave her children unattended. She didn't shut off the air conditioning and walk out the door. He'd taught her everything, and now he was about to find out if she'd remembered any of it. "I'm on my way," Rick said. "Call 911. Report her missing. Do it now." He hung up and grabbed his keys, his mind already running through the possibilities. Accident, medical emergency, foul play. The scenarios a cop catalogues automatically, the ones a father doesn't want to name. But Rick couldn't separate the two. He was both, and right now that meant he understood exactly what Nathan's call implied. Denise had spent years learning what to do if someone ever came for her. Rick had made sure of it. He'd trained her for abduction, for survival, for leaving a trail that would lead back to whoever took her. It was preparation you hope stays theoretical. Knowledge you pray never gets tested. Now it was being tested. Rick knew one thing with absolute certainty. Denise would never leave those children alone in that house. Ever. Which meant she didn't leave. Someone took her. And he wasn't waiting for permission to start looking. By the time Rick arrived, police were already questioning Nathan like a suspect. The responding officers had gotten there first, and their tone made it clear where their focus had landed. Nathan stood in the living room of his own home, answering questions with a kind of exhausted confusion that comes from being treated like a criminal when your wife has just vanished. "When did you last see her? Any arguments recently? Where were you this afternoon?" The questions every husband gets asked when a woman goes missing, because statistically it's almost always the husband. Rick understood that. It was textbook procedure in missing person cases involving a young wife and mother. You start with the spouse. The vast majority of the time, that's where the answers are. The officers were doing their job, following the protocol that solves most of these cases before they turn into something worse. But the moment they saw Rick, everything changed. "Sergeant Goff," one of them said. Recognition immediate. Rick nodded. "Nathan's my son-in-law. Denise is my daughter." The shift was instant. The officers knew Rick, veteran fugitive tracker, decorated deputy, a cop who'd spent decades working cases just like this one. They trusted his judgment, and his presence carried weight that no amount of Nathan's protests could have matched. The interrogation posture softened. The circling stopped. "Nathan didn't do anything to Denise," Rick said. His voice was calm, but there was no room for argument in it. "He came home and found her gone. That's what happened." In law enforcement, you always think it's the husband. Rick understood that. He also knew, with everything he had, that it wasn't. He'd known Nathan for years, knew the kind of father he was, the kind of husband. Knew his routines, his character, the way he looked at Denise when he thought no one was watching. But more than that, Rick knew the evidence. Nathan's timeline was tight. He'd been at work, then came straight home. There was no window for him to have done this. And Rick had seen enough staged scenes to know what they looked like. This wasn't one. The house showed signs of a struggle. Subtle, but there. A chair slightly out of place. The air conditioning shut off for no reason. The children left alone in a way Denise would never have allowed. This was an abduction, not a domestic incident gone wrong. "We need to move fast," Rick said. "She's been gone at least an hour, maybe more. Every minute we waste looking at Nathan is a minute her abductor gets farther away." The officers shifted into gear. Radio chatter picked up. The questions stopped being about Nathan and started being about what they actually needed. Timeline, description, vehicles, anyone who might have been in the area. With Nathan cleared, Rick had one lead left to check. The neighbour, the only other person on this isolated stretch of property. If anyone had seen something that afternoon, it would be her. And what she'd seen was enough to frighten her back into her own house. The neighbour opened the door before Rick could knock. She'd been watching from her window, waiting. She was the only other person living on this isolated stretch of property. And she'd seen something that afternoon, something that had frightened her enough to stay inside. Door locked. Until she saw the police cars arrive next door. "I saw a car," she said before Rick could ask. "Around 2 o'clock, a green Camaro pulled right into Denise's driveway." Rick kept his voice steady. "Did you recognize the driver?" "No, I'd never seen him before. Didn't know him from the neighborhood. Didn't know him at all." That detail mattered. This wasn't someone Denise knew, wasn't someone who belonged there. Rick could feel the case shifting from missing person to something darker with every word. "What happened when he pulled in?" Rick asked. The neighbor hesitated, and Rick saw the fear still sitting just under the surface. Whatever she'd seen, it had stayed with her. "When he pulled in the driveway, he kept staring at me," she said. "So I got scared and I ran inside of my house." Rick understood immediately. This wasn't a glance. This was a deliberate stare, the kind that lasts too long, that communicates intent, that tells you something is wrong before you can name what it is. The kind of stare that sends a woman running for her door in the middle of the afternoon. "How long did he stare?" Rick asked. "Long enough that I knew I needed to get inside. He didn't look away, just kept watching me until I went in and locked the door." Some predators hide in shadows. Others walk up to a front door at 2 in the afternoon and don't bother to look away when someone sees them. Rick worked through the timeline. 2 o'clock. That was over an hour before Nathan came home. An hour and a half, maybe, since Denise had last spoken to her mother that morning. This man had driven up in broad daylight in a neighborhood where people could see and taken her anyway. The car, Rick said. Green Camaro. Anything else you remember? License plate, damage, anything distinctive? The neighbor shook her head. Just green, older model, I think. But I didn't get the plate. I was too busy getting inside. It was enough. Rick had tracked fugitives with less. A vehicle description, a timeline, a witness who could confirm this wasn't someone Denise knew. The pieces were starting to form a picture, and it was the picture Rick had feared from the moment Nathan called. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was an abduction. Premeditated enough that the man had driven to a specific house. Deliberate enough that he didn't care when a neighbor saw him. Bold enough that he'd done it at 2 p.m. when anyone could have been watching. Rick picked up his radio. Within minutes, every unit in Charlotte County would be looking for a green Camaro they couldn't yet connect to a name. But they had the car. And for a fugitive tracker, that was enough to start a manhunt. What Rick didn't know yet was that somewhere in that same county, the man was still driving. The helicopters went up first. Within minutes of Rick's call, the full force of Charlotte County law enforcement mobilized in a way the area hadn't seen in years. Helicopters swept low over neighborhoods and farmland, their rotors cutting through the late afternoon air. Bloodhounds went out on leashes, working scent trails from Denise's house. Patrol units fanned across the county in a grid pattern, every officer scanning for a green Camaro that might still be somewhere on these roads. Rick stayed on the radio, coordinating the search with the kind of precision that comes from decades tracking fugitives. I have helicopters, dogs, and every unit on it, he said. His voice was steady, professional, but underneath was a father's desperation. I'm not going to give up until I find my daughter. Every resource Rick had access to was now deployed. Every favor he'd earned, every connection he'd built over his career, all of it went into finding that green Camaro before it disappeared beyond the county line or into a garage where no helicopter could see it, somewhere in that same county, at that same moment. Michael King drove a green Camaro through the search grid, untouched, unremarkable. Just another car on another road. Exactly where the manhunt hadn't reached yet. He was within the radius they were searching, moving through the same airspace the helicopters scanned. Driving roads the patrol cars would eventually cover, but not yet. In a search like this, every passing minute rewrites the odds. Rick knew that better than anyone. The first hour is when you find them, close, panicked, still nearby. The second hour is when the radius expands and the possibilities multiply. After that, you're chasing probabilities instead of certainties, and the chances of recovery drop with every mile. The radio chatter was constant, units reporting their sectors clear, helicopters calling out negative sightings, K9 teams losing the scent at the end of the driveway where a vehicle had been parked. Every report that came back without a green Camaro was another minute Denise spent wherever she'd been taken. Afternoon turned toward evening. The light began to change, shadows lengthening across the roads and fields. Patrol cars kept moving. Helicopters kept circling, but the momentum was starting to feel like weight instead of progress. 2 hours since Nathan had found the house empty. 2 hours since the neighbor had seen that green Camaro pull into the driveway. 2 hours. And nothing. Rick stayed glued to the radio, listening to every call, monitoring every sector, waiting for the one report that would break the pattern of negatives. But it didn't come. The search turned up empty roads, cleared neighborhoods, and no sign of the car or the man who'd taken his daughter. For the next 2 hours, the search would turn up nothing at all. Every patrol car, every helicopter pass, every K9 team, nothing. And then, at 6:13 that evening, a phone call came in from Sarasota County that no one expected. A 911 dispatcher had just answered a call from a woman in distress. And the woman on that call was Denise. The voice on the line was crying, apologizing, saying she just wanted to see her family. At 6:13 that evening, a 911 dispatcher in Sarasota County answered what seemed like a routine distress call. A woman clearly upset, her words coming in rushed fragments. 911, what's the case? The dispatcher asked. I'm sorry, I just want to go, the woman said. I'm sorry, I just want to see my family. I'm sorry. The dispatcher worked to keep her calm, to get basic information. Your name's Denise. What's your last name? But the woman didn't answer directly. She kept apologizing, kept saying she wanted to go, kept repeating phrases that sounded like she was talking to someone else. And then the dispatcher started to understand this woman wasn't just calling for help. She was performing for someone sitting right next to her. Denise was conducting 2 conversations at once. Every word she said had 2 audiences. The man in the driver's seat who'd taken her, and the dispatcher who could send help. She was making it sound like she was talking to her captor, while actually feeding information to the line. Do you have a blindfold on? Denise asked, her voice shaking. I can't see. The dispatcher caught it immediately. She's not asking him. She's telling me. She's blindfolded. It was brilliant. Terrifying, but brilliant. Denise was describing her situation by pretending to ask questions, by making statements that sounded like conversation with King, but were actually intelligence for law enforcement. She was dropping location clues, describing what she could sense, all disguised as the frightened pleas of a hostage. To think clearly when you're terrified takes training. To think in 2 layers at once, that takes something else entirely. Rick had spent years teaching her this exact skill. How to leave clues. How to communicate without seeming to. How to use whatever access you have to give investigators what they need. She'd grown up absorbing this knowledge, and now, blindfolded in a moving car with the man who'd taken her from her children, she was using every bit of it. The dispatcher stayed on the line, asking careful questions, trying to get more without tipping off whoever was listening. Every second of recording was evidence. Every word Denise managed to say was another piece of the puzzle. And then, suddenly, King realized where his phone was. The background noise changed. There was movement, a sharp sound of discovery, his voice cutting in. The call went dead mid-sentence. Silence replacing Denise's frightened voice so abruptly it left the dispatcher staring at the receiver. He'd caught her, understood what she'd been doing, taken the phone back. But Denise had done exactly what her father taught her to do. She'd left a trail. The recording was already being escalated, the dispatcher confirming the name Denise. The call had been brief, cut off before she could give them everything, but she'd succeeded in the most important thing. She'd confirmed she was alive. And 10 minutes later, a second 911 call would come in, with something even more valuable. the kidnapper's name. Rick had heard 1,000 voices in distress over his career, but never his own daughter's. Sarasota authorities contacted him shortly after the 911 call ended, asking him to confirm whether the voice on the recording belonged to Denise. They patched the audio through, and Rick listened to his daughter's voice come across the line, frightened, apologizing, saying she just wanted to see her family. "That's her," Rick said. "That's Denise. She was alive. Terrified, but alive. And she was doing exactly what he'd taught her to do." Rick could hear it in the way she spoke, in the pauses between her words, in the questions she asked that weren't really questions at all. She was thinking in layers, performing for her captor while feeding intelligence to the dispatcher. Even under that kind of fear, she was executing the training perfectly. She was talking to Nathan in her head, to her children, to him. And she was doing it while sitting next to the man who'd taken her. The call had ended abruptly, King discovering the phone, cutting off whatever else Denise had been trying to communicate. But she'd succeeded in the most important thing, confirming her identity, proving she was alive, leaving a trail for them to follow. Rick felt the weight of pride and terror in equal measure. His daughter was fighting back with everything he'd given her. Now he had to find her before that fight ran out of time. 10 minutes later, at 6:22 that evening, a second 911 call came in. An anonymous caller phoned in with information that would give the case its first real break. The voice on the line was matter of fact, offering details that investigators had been desperate for since the search began. "What's the cousin's name?" the dispatcher asked, following the thread of the caller's information. "Michael King," the caller said. "What's the cousin driving?" "A green Camaro, the same vehicle the neighbor had seen. The same car every unit in Charlotte County had been searching for. But now it wasn't just a car. It was connected to a person, with a name, a history, an address, someone they could find. Michael King. In a manhunt, a name changes everything. A vehicle description puts eyes on roads and helicopters in the air. But a name opens databases, pulls records, connects dots that witnesses and patrols can't see. A name turns a shadow into a target. Rick took the information and immediately ran it through the system. Michael King. The name came back with an address, Sardinia Avenue in Northport, Florida. Not far from Denise's house. Close enough that he could have been watching, could have known her routine, could have picked that Thursday morning deliberately. For the first time since 3:30 that afternoon, Rick had somewhere to send his teen. Not just a car description, not just a witness account, a full name, a known person, someone in the system, Michael King. And within minutes, they'd have an address. The TV was so loud they could hear it from the street. The raid squad reached Michael King's address on Sardinia Avenue in Northport within minutes, hoping to catch him before he knew they had his name. But when they pulled up to the house, no one came to the door. No car in the driveway. Just that television, blaring at full volume from somewhere inside, the noise pouring out into the Florida evening like a deliberate signal. "Nobody's coming to the door," the radio crackled. They made the call to enter. The door opened into rooms that felt wrong the moment they crossed the threshold. The TV echoed through the house. Too loud for anyone to think or sleep or live with comfortably. But there was no one there to turn it down. The house was empty. Not just empty of people, empty of almost everything. furniture mostly gone, trash scattered across floors, walls bare. This wasn't a home someone was living in. This was a place someone had already abandoned, stripped to the bones and left behind with the television screaming at full volume like a middle finger to whoever showed up looking. King had known they'd come. He'd left the TV on to make the house sound occupied, to buy himself time while the raid squad wasted precious minutes surrounding a building he'd already fled. In Rick's line of work, a location change meant one thing. The predator knows the net is closing and is trying to stay ahead of it. But King hadn't taken everything with him. In the bedroom, officers found what he couldn't carry: a hair tie and a strip of duct tape with long strands of light brown hair stuck to the adhesive. "Would you have duct tape?" one officer radioed, "with long strands that look like blonde brown hair." The description matched. Denise's hair, long, light brown, unmistakable. She'd been in this room, not days ago, recently, hours ago maybe. Held here, restrained with duct tape, in this stripped-down bedroom while King decided what to do next. The hair ties sat on the floor like evidence of a ghost. She'd been here, and now she was gone. Rick absorbed the information with the grim understanding of someone who tracked fugitives long enough to know what patterns mean. A first location abandoned this quickly. A second location already in play. Evidence left behind because there wasn't time to clean it all up. This was a man who knew law enforcement was closing in and was moving faster to compensate. Every hour gave him more distance. Every move made her harder to find. And a second location, this late in an abduction, meant the window for a live recovery was already closing. The statistics didn't lie. The longer a victim stayed missing, the narrower the odds became. Rick had seen it too many times to pretend otherwise. She'd been in that room. Recently. The hair was proof she'd been held there, duct-taped, within the last few hours. And now she wasn't anywhere they could find her. But at that exact moment, someone else was seeing something that could have ended this search. At the stoplight, a hand came up from the back seat of the Camaro and started banging on the window. A witness driving on Highway 41 pulled up to a red light at 6:30 that evening and found herself next to a green Camaro. She heard screaming from inside. Not a playful shout, not music, not anything ambiguous. Screaming, loud, desperate, the kind that makes your blood go cold even through car windows and road noise. The hand kept banging, someone in the back seat frantic, trying to get attention, trying to signal that something was wrong. The witness grabbed her phone and called 911 immediately. "I'm on 41 going south, and I was at a stoplight, and a van pulled up next to me, and like Camaro, and they were screaming in the car," she told the dispatcher. Like screaming, 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 and not a happy scream, like "get me out of here" scream. The dispatcher asked questions. She could still hear it, that voice from the back seat, terror condensed into sound. She asked if she should follow the car, if she should try to keep eyes on it until police arrived. But King sensed something. Maybe he saw her on the phone. Maybe he caught her staring. Maybe it was just instinct. The same animal awareness that had kept him ahead of the search all day. Whatever it was, he didn't wait for the light to change. He blew through the red and accelerated hard, leaving the witness at the intersection with nothing but a phone call and the memory of that screaming. One car length away. That's how close someone came to ending this search that evening. The witness stayed on the line. gave the dispatcher everything she could: direction of travel, description of the car, what she'd heard. The green Camaro. Every unit in the county was supposed to be looking for a witness who'd been close enough to hear Denise screaming, close enough that intervention might have been possible if units had been dispatched immediately. But somewhere in the 911 center, a critical mistake was made. The Charlotte County 911 dispatcher who received the call noted the information, but no officers were dispatched to the location. No alert went out over the radio. The call, with all its urgency and specificity, simply didn't reach the people who needed to hear it. Rick stayed glued to his radio, monitoring every update. He never heard about the Highway 41 sighting, never knew that a witness had just confirmed Denise was alive. In the car they were searching for, screaming for help at a stoplight minutes away. The green Camaro vanished into the night on Highway 41. And the one call that could have ended the search that evening, the witness who heard Denise screaming, who saw the exact car Rick's entire team was looking for, never reached the people who needed to hear it. Just like that, Denise disappeared from sight. It would be another 3 hours before they saw that Camaro again. It had been 3 hours since the Camaro vanished on Highway 41 when Rick's radio finally came alive again. 9:15 that night. 6 hours since Nathan had found the house empty and called with panic in his voice. 6 hours since Denise had been taken from her children, from her life, from everything she'd been doing that ordinary Thursday morning. And now, finally, green Camaro spotted, pursuit initiated. Highway patrol troopers had eyes on the vehicle. They were moving in, coordinating to box him in, making sure he couldn't run again. Rick listened to the chatter. Every instinct he had focused on that radio. They'd found him. After helicopters and bloodhounds and every unit in the county searching. After the empty house and the missed sightings and the hours of nothing, they'd finally found Michael King. The pursuit didn't last long. King pulled over, officers surrounded the Camaro, weapons drawn, commands shouted. He was arrested without resistance, pulled from the driver's seat and cuffed on the side of the highway. Rick waited for the next radio transmission, the one that would tell him Denise was there, that she was alive, that 6 hours of hell were finally over. The radio went quiet for a moment. Then one line came through that Rick would never forget. Female is not with the vehicle. King was alone. The back seat was empty. Denise wasn't there. Hope collapsed into something darker. They had the man who'd taken her. They had his car. But they didn't have her. And every cop listening to that radio transmission understood what it meant. King had already moved her somewhere else, or hidden her, or done something that meant finding him didn't automatically mean finding her alive. Michael King was transported to the Charlotte County Sheriff's Office and placed in an interrogation room. The interrogating detective listened to King's claim that he was the victim who'd been kidnapped, reading the lie for what it was, but needing evidence to break it. Investigators expected him to crack under questioning, to reveal where Denise was, to give them something they could work with. Instead, King told them a very different story. He claimed he was the one who'd been kidnapped, that he was a victim too, a hostage forced to drive that car against his will. "You come out to me and said you were the hostage," the detective said, making sure King understood they'd heard his story. "You were a victim. You were a hostage. Right. You understand that?" King stuck to it, didn't waver, presented himself as someone who'd been coerced, controlled, made to do things he didn't choose. There's a specific kind of lie that predators tell when they're caught. The kind that inverts reality so completely it sounds absurd until you realize they actually believe it might work. Investigators didn't believe him. But without Denise, belief wasn't enough. They needed proof King was lying. And the proof was still sitting in the back seat of his car, waiting to be found. They just had to search it. The search team found it in the back seat of the Camaro, half hidden between the cushions. A heart-shaped ring. Small, simple, with a little stone in the middle. The kind of jewelry that could mean everything or nothing, depending on who it belonged to and how it got there. The search team, conducting a thorough evidence sweep of King's vehicle, bagged it and passed it to Detective Morales, who called Rick and Nathan to identify jewelry found in the car. Hoping family could confirm whether it belonged to Denise, Detective Morales called me and said there's some jewelry that was left in his vehicle that they needed me to identify. Nathan would later recount when Detective Morales showed him the ring. Nathan didn't need to think. He didn't need to examine it closely or check for markings. He knew it the moment he saw it. "Is this her ring?" Morales asked. "Yes," Nathan said. "That's the first ring I gave her. First Valentine's Day." The first Valentine's Day they'd spent together. Back when they were young and everything was just beginning. A simple, heart-shaped ring with a small stone, the kind of gift that doesn't cost much, but means everything because of when it was given and what it represented. She'd worn it constantly, even after they got engaged, even after they got married. She loved that ring more than pieces worth 10 times as much. "I know it doesn't sound very special or romantic," Nathan said, "but that ring was more special than even her engagement ring." There are objects we carry because they're valuable, and then there are objects we carry because they're us. That ring was the second kind, and Denise had taken it off. In the back of that car, with Michael King in the driver's seat, she'd slipped that ring off her finger, the one she never removed, the one that meant more to her than any diamond, and hidden it between the seat cushions, where King wouldn't see, but investigators eventually would. She knew she wasn't going to be found, probably, Nathan said, understanding what his wife had done in those moments. She'd assessed the situation with the clarity Rick had trained into her, understood the odds, and made a choice. If she didn't make it out, she was going to make damn sure they had evidence. She had the presence of mind to take that ring off, put it in the car, Rick said, recognizing his own training coming back to him through his daughter's actions. She knew King might not leave witnesses. She knew they'd find his car eventually, even if they didn't find her. So she left proof she'd been there, a piece of herself that couldn't be explained away or denied. It was the ring Nathan gave her their first Valentine's Day together. Simple, small, more meaningful than any diamond, and Denise had hidden it there on purpose. The moment she understood she might not be found, she was leaving them a trail, one piece at a time. But King wasn't going to make it any easier than that. The detectives returned to the interrogation room with a calculated strategy. Pretend to believe King's story and hope he'd reveal more. With the ring confirmed as Denise's, the ring she'd hidden deliberately in the back seat, knowing what it would prove. Investigators had physical evidence connecting her to that car, but evidence didn't tell them where she was now. Only King could do that. And if he truly believed they'd bought his story about being kidnapped himself, maybe he'd slip up. Maybe he'd reveal something. It was a calculated gamble. The detectives sat down across from King with expressions of false sympathy. "We understand you were scared," they said. "Tell us what happened. Tell us who forced you." They acted concerned, supportive, like they believed every word of his absurd claim. Like a man who'd just spent 6 hours driving around with a kidnapped woman could somehow also be a victim. They played along, hoping desperation would make him careless. King answered at first. Explained his version, the story where someone else had controlled him, made him do things against his will. But his responses started getting shorter, more guarded. Something in the detective's tone, or maybe just instinct, he was reading the room differently now. There's a moment in every interrogation when the suspect realizes exactly how much power they still have left. King had reached that moment. He understood they were trying to trap him, trying to use sympathy as leverage to get him to reveal Denise's location. Before we tell you what King does next, are you still with us? Comment A if you think he'll keep talking, or B if you think he shuts down, and add one short reason why. Quick note, what follows includes recreated dialogue for narrative purposes. The core truth is what matters. The room temperature shifted. King stopped explaining, stopped defending. He'd been careful for 6 hours. Careful enough to move her to a second location, careful enough to ditch physical evidence, careful enough to come up with a story when he was caught. He wasn't about to break now just because 2 detectives pretended to believe him. And then King said the words that ended the interrogation. He requested an attorney. Just like that, it was over. Legally, the questioning had to stop. He didn't have to say another word, didn't have to explain where he'd taken Denise after leaving his house, didn't have to reveal what he'd done in those hours between the Highway 41 sighting and his arrest. The door closed on any chance of him talking. The detectives left that room with a confirmed victim's ring, a suspect who'd stopped talking, and no idea where Denise was. With King silent, the trail on Denise went cold. They had the ring, they had the hair.
I opened the
The
door.
newlyweds
and
waste
the
no
first
time
thing I
in making a new
noticed
life
was the
together.
heat. Like, it was
And
super
in
hot outside.
1982,
I walked over
just
into the
9
bedroom
months
because
after
Noah
their wedding,
was crying,
Karen
but
and
Denise
Chris
she's
welcomed
not
their
there,
son
and
Michael into
I don't
the
know where she
family.
is.
But without King talking, they faced 500 miles of Florida forest and highway to search, one stretch at a time, and every hour that passed made the odds worse. 2 days after the kidnapping, the call finally came in. January 19th, 2008. The search teams had been combing Charlotte County for 2 days straight, following every possible lead, checking every remote area King might have accessed. 48 hours of helicopters and patrol units and K9 teams working their way through hundreds of square miles of Florida forest and highway, looking for any sign of Denise. 48 hours of Rick monitoring every radio call, every update, hoping for the one transmission that would end the search the right way. But with every hour that passed, the odds narrowed. Rick knew the statistics. Everyone on that search knew them. The first 24 hours are when you find survivors. After that, you're searching for closure instead of rescue. Then the call. We think we got a spot of interest. You two bring their bloodhound down there. A remote wooded area in Charlotte County. Isolated. The kind of place someone could stop without being seen from the road. Rick coordinated the bloodhounds to the location. Holding on to the version of this where she was injured, maybe unconscious, but alive somewhere nearby. He'd spent 2 days refusing to let go of that possibility. The bloodhounds were brought to the site of interest and immediately began working the area, trained to detect what human searchers couldn't. They moved through the woods with purpose, noses down, covering ground systematically. And then they stopped at one specific spot, a patch of disturbed ground, sand covering the surface, like someone had tried to hide what was underneath. When the search team cleared some of the sand away, there were traces of what looked like blood. Bloodhounds are trained to detect what humans can't smell, and when they find what they're looking for, they don't just signal, they stay. The dogs would not leave the spot. They stayed fixated on that patch of ground, that specific location, refusing to move, even when their handlers tried to pull them away. It was the behavior Rick had seen before on other searches. The behavior that meant the dogs had found something significant, something human. Rick stood at the edge of that clearing, watching the dogs work, and felt the professional knowledge he'd built over decades of law enforcement override the father's desperate hope he'd been carrying for 2 days. He'd worked enough searches to know exactly what it meant when bloodhounds refused to move off a location. They'd found human remains. Not a survivor waiting to be rescued. Not his daughter hiding injured in the woods. A burial site. The dogs found a patch of disturbed ground, covered in sand, with what looked like traces of blood, and they would not move off it. Rick had worked enough searches to know exactly what that meant. It meant the search was over. They brought in the excavation team at first light. The recovery team excavated the site with careful, methodical precision, following protocols for human remains recovery. Every layer of sand removed carefully, every inch photographed, every piece of evidence documented before it was touched. This was a crime scene now, not just a search site, and everything had to be preserved for what would come next. Rick stayed on scene. He'd spent decades working recoveries, knew the protocols by heart, understood why each step took as long as it did. But professional understanding didn't make the waiting any easier when it was his daughter under that sand. He stood at the perimeter, watching the team work, feeling the gap between what he knew professionally and what he could bear personally widen with every minute that passed. The radio crackled, confirmation coming through from the recovery site. Positive identification. I heard on the radio. Came in a couple hours later. There was a positive ID on her, Rick would later recall. The body they'd recovered was Denise Amber Lee. Not someone else, not a mistake. His daughter. Found exactly where the bloodhounds said she'd be. I had to sit down, Rick said. We had to tell our kids, and it's tough. It's heart-wrenching. In his years on the force, Rick had delivered this news to other families, had stood in living rooms and driveways and hospital waiting areas, watching people's faces change when they understood what he was telling them. He'd learned how to keep his voice steady, how to give them space to process, how to be present for the worst moment of someone's life. He'd never had to take it himself. There are things you spend a career learning to say to other families. And then there's the moment you have to say it to your own. Rick went home. Susan Goff, his wife, saw his face when he walked through the door and knew before he said anything. She'd spent decades as a cop's wife, reading the weight he carried home, understanding what different silences meant. This one was different from all the others. Rick came home and said that they had found her, Susan would later recount. But she already understood what finding meant in this context. What a recovery team meant versus a rescue team. What 2 days of searching with no good news meant for the odds. She asked the question anyway, needing to hear it confirmed even though she already knew. "She's not alive, is she?" Rick didn't say anything. There were no words left that would make this different. No way to deliver the news that would soften what it meant. He just shook his head. No. It's a tough thing to go through, no matter if it's your kid or anybody else's. But when it's your kid, when it's the daughter you taught to survive, when it's the mother of your grandsons, when it's a person you spent 2 days refusing to believe was gone, the silence is all that's left. The search for Denise was over, and the fight for justice was about to begin. 19 months later. Rick walked into a courtroom and sat down across from the man who killed his daughter. August 24th, 2009. The prosecution team prepared to present overwhelming circumstantial evidence and, most powerfully, Denise's own voice from beyond the grave. Michael King stood in the Charlotte County courtroom, formally charged with first-degree murder, kidnapping, and sexual battery. The judge read the charges methodically. Each one a documented fact of what had happened on January 17th, 2008. The families sat together in the rows behind the prosecution table. Rick, Nathan, Susan Goff, Rick's wife, who'd asked the question 19 months ago and gotten the answer in a silent headshake. Amanda, Denise's sister, who'd become a 911 dispatcher in her honor. They'd spent 19 months processing the loss, 19 months preparing for this moment. 19 months doesn't heal anything. It just gives grief time to settle into something you can stand up with. The judge asked King how he pleaded, and despite the ring found in his car, the one Denise had deliberately hidden there, despite the hair with roots still attached, pulled out deliberately because she knew about DNA, despite the 911 call where her voice and his were both on the recording, despite her body found buried exactly where the bloodhound said it would be, despite everything. Not guilty, King said. Not guilty to all charges. He was forcing a trial, making them prove it, making the family sit through every piece of evidence, every testimony, every moment of what had been done to Denise. He wasn't accepting responsibility. He wasn't offering a plea. He was making the state build the entire case from the ground up and present it to 12 strangers who would decide his fate. The defense attorney laid out a strategy focused on the prosecution's missing pieces, particularly the lack of a murder weapon. And they had one legitimate hole to work with. No gun was ever found, no weapon was ever recovered that could be definitively linked to Denise's death. That was a gap in the evidence, and the defense intended to drive attention straight to it. Because we didn't have a gun. That was a hole, the defense would argue. That was a big hole.
Michael King? And what does he look like? I just know he has dark hair, he's
Just
white.
gone to his
What's the
mother's.
cousin driving? A green
I said, that's
Camaro?
okay, I went.
The prosecution had circumstantial evidence. They had forensics. They had the ring, the hair, the 911 recordings, the timeline, the witness sightings, the burial site. But they didn't have the one piece of physical evidence that made murder cases straightforward: the weapon itself. The defense planned to exploit every gap, every missing element, every piece the state couldn't produce. They'd make the prosecution prove murder without being able to show the jury exactly how it had been done. They'd draw reasonable doubt from the spaces between what was known and what could only be inferred. The defense had one hole to work with. There was no murder weapon. No gun was ever recovered, and they intended to use it. Draw attention to every gap, every missing piece the state couldn't produce. But what the defense didn't know yet was what Denise had left behind. The prosecution was about to play a recording. The courtroom went completely silent as the prosecution queued up the recording. The jury sat in complete silence as the prosecution prepared to play the 911 recording that would become the most powerful evidence in the case. No murder weapon, no eyewitness testimony from the moment of death, but something potentially more powerful. Denise's own voice, speaking from January 17th, 2008, telling them exactly what had happened. For Rick and Nathan, sitting in the courtroom behind the prosecution table, this meant hearing her again. Her terror, her voice under stress. The thing they'd already heard privately, now being played for strangers who would decide whether justice got served. For the jury, it was about to be something they'd never heard before. The recording started. Denise's voice came through the courtroom speakers, distressed and apologizing. "I'm sorry. I just want to see my family." She sounded frightened. She sounded like someone begging for her life. But as the recording continued, something else emerged. The structure underneath the fear. The coded conversation. "Do you have a blindfold on?" Denise asked on the recording. "I can't see." She wasn't asking King if he had a blindfold. She was telling the dispatcher that she did, that she couldn't see where they were going because he'd covered her eyes. Every question was information. Every statement, disguised as conversation with her captor, was actually intelligence being fed to law enforcement. She was conducting two conversations at once, performing for King while building a case against him in real time. Some evidence testifies for itself. Some victims become their own best witnesses. And then the jury heard its King's voice, unmistakable, in the background of the call. He was right there, sitting next to her in that car, while she held his phone and fed information to 911 without his knowledge. His voice proved placement, proved he was with her, proved the call wasn't some elaborate fiction, but a woman trapped with her kidnapper. Thinking clearly enough to leave a trail, the room understood. This wasn't just a 911 call. This was a woman who'd grown up around law enforcement, who understood evidence and forensics, using every second she had to make sure even if she didn't survive, they'd know exactly who took her. She'd assessed the situation, understood the odds, and decided that if this was how it ended, she was going to solve her own murder. The defense had talked about gaps in the evidence, about the missing murder weapon, about what the prosecution couldn't prove. But Denise had left something more powerful than physical evidence. She'd left herself her voice, her intelligence, her training, her absolute refusal to disappear without making sure they knew who did this. The room understood. Before the verdict was read, before any other witness took the stand, the jury heard exactly what Denise had done. She'd solved her own murder, left the evidence they needed, and done it all while terrified and trapped. And that wasn't even all she'd left behind. The prosecution held up a small plastic evidence bag, and Nathan Lee's breath caught in his throat. Inside was a heart-shaped ring, delicate silver, unmistakable. He'd given it to her years ago, their first Valentine's Day together. She'd worn it every day after that. "Do you recognize this ring, Mr. Lee?" the prosecutor asked. Nathan nodded, unable to speak at first. "That's hers," he finally said. "She never took it off." Rick Goff stepped forward to explain where they'd found it in King's Camaro. On the passenger side, near where Denise had been held. Not on the floor, not lost in a struggle, placed deliberately where investigators would see it, where they'd connect it to the car, to her, to him. She'd slipped it off her finger, knowing exactly what she was doing. The ring wasn't just jewellery. It was evidence she'd planted, a beacon for the people who'd come looking for her, and she'd known they would come. She just didn't know if they'd make it in time. The second evidence bag came next. Strands of dark brown hair, roots still attached, white follicles visible against the clear plastic. Found stuck to the duct tape that had bound her. The medical examiner confirmed what the roots meant. This hair hadn't fallen out naturally. It had been pulled out forcibly, torn from the scalp. The courtroom AC hummed steadily, but Nathan felt like he couldn't breathe. The ring in that bag was the same one that had caught the light when she'd held their sons. Rick continued, his voice steady but edged with something deeper. Respect, maybe. Awe. She pulled hair out by the roots, Rick said. She knew about DNA, had to have the roots and stuff. Denise thought like a cop. The words landed hard. The jury understood immediately. Denise hadn't just fought back physically. She'd fought back scientifically, strategically, with the same forensic awareness Rick and his team used every day. She knew DNA evidence required follicles. She knew they'd test everything in that car. So she made sure they'd have what they needed, even if it meant pulling her own hair out by the roots while bound and terrified. Photos showed exactly where each piece had been found. The ring near the passenger seat, the hair adhered to the duct tape King had used on her. Every piece of evidence pointed to one inescapable conclusion. Denise had understood what was happening to her, had prepared for the worst possible outcome, and had made absolutely certain that even if she didn't survive, her killer wouldn't escape. And now the jury had everything she'd left them. Her voice, her evidence, her unbreakable will to be heard. The defense had nothing left to say. The moment everyone had been waiting for was here. The jury filed back into the courtroom after just 2 hours. Nathan Lee watched them take their seats, hands gripped tight. 2 hours. That told him something. Rick sat beside him, jaw set, eyes tracking every juror's face. The judge presided from the bench with formal gravity, the weight of what was about to unfold evident in every deliberate movement. He turned to the jury. Has the jury reached a verdict? The foreman stood, paper trembling in his hands. We have, Your Honor. Please read the verdict. We, the jury, find the defendant, Michael King, guilty of first-degree murder. The foreman's voice steadied. The verdict is unanimous. The words landed like a gavel strike. Nathan felt his breath release all at once, a sound he hadn't realized he'd been holding for 18 months. Beside him, Rick's shoulders dropped, years of tension draining out. Behind them, quiet sobs broke out. Relief, vindication, justice. Michael King sat motionless at the defense table. No reaction, no surprise, just that same blank expression. The sentencing phase moved quickly. The prosecution outlined the aggravating factors: heinous, atrocious, cruel. The defense had nothing that could counter the mountain of evidence Denise herself had left behind. When the jury returned, it took less than an hour. The jury recommends the sentence of death. The judge accepted without hesitation. Michael King, you are hereby sentenced to death by lethal injection. The gavel came down with finality. Nathan couldn't look at King. He could only think of Denise in that car, pulling her hair out by the roots, slipping off the ring, dialing 911 on a stolen phone.
Can you see, or do you have a blindfold on?
She'd known this exact moment might come. She'd made absolutely certain they'd have everything they needed. Rick turned to Nathan, and the look they exchanged said everything. 2 hours of deliberation for a death sentence, unanimous on every count. That speed told the whole story. Denise had built the case against her own killer so thoroughly that the jury had no doubt left. The ring placed deliberately where investigators would find it. The hair with roots attached. The 911 call where she'd risked everything to leave clues. Every single piece had mattered. She did this, Rick said quietly. Every piece of evidence, every second of those calls, she made sure we'd be standing here today. Nathan nodded, unable to speak. Denise had fought back in a way that transcended the physical struggle. She'd thought like a cop because she was a cop's daughter. She'd understood forensic evidence, understood what investigators would need, understood that even if she didn't survive, her killer wouldn't escape. And she'd been right. Michael King would never hurt anyone again. The system had failed to save her. The misfiled 911 call, the missed opportunities. But Denise had made certain the system would deliver justice. The verdict was justice. The sentence was accountability. But as Nathan stood to leave the courtroom, he knew there was one more thing Denise would want. Something that would make sure no other family went through what his had. Her voice was about to reach even further. Nathan stood in the Florida legislature chambers 6 months after the verdict, holding a folder of 911 transcripts he wished didn't exist. Inside were copies of Jane Kowalski's highway call, the witness who'd seen Denise screaming in King's car, banging on the windows, trying to escape. The call that was filed but never transferred, never acted on. The call that could have saved her life. The Florida legislators listened as Nathan laid out what had gone wrong. Not just one mistake, a systemic failure. A witness saw my wife in that car and called 911, Nathan said, his voice steady but strained. That call was never transferred. If it had been, she might be alive. The words landed hard in the chamber. Rick stood beside him, jaw set, the weight of every missed opportunity etched into his face. Amanda, Denise's sister, sat in the front row. Her presence a quiet reminder of what was lost. "We're not here for sympathy," Nathan continued. "We're here to make sure the next family doesn't stand where we're standing." The legislators understood. This wasn't about blame anymore. It was about building something that would prevent the next tragedy. Rick worked directly with the committee, translating the investigation failures into policy fixes. He knew the technical details, what protocols had been missing, where the training gaps existed, how the call transfer system had broken down at every critical moment. 200 hours minimum, Rick explained. Every operator, every county. No more missed calls because someone didn't know the protocol. The Denise Amber Lee Act took shape over months of drafting and revision. Mandatory minimum training for all Florida 911 operators. Not just basic instruction, but comprehensive preparation for high-stress scenarios. Standardized call transfer protocols across jurisdictions. Accountability measures for dispatcher negligence. Every piece designed to close the gaps that had cost Denise her life. Rick thought about that highway call every single day. The witness who saw everything, the dispatcher who did nothing, the minutes that could have changed everything. That call haunted him, but now it was becoming the thing he and Nathan would prevent for every family that came after. "We name it after her, the Denise Amber Lee Act," one legislator proposed. "Her name becomes the standard." Nathan felt something shift. Not relief, not closure, but purpose. Denise's name would be attached to every 911 operator trained under this law. Her legacy would be embedded in the system that had failed her, transforming it into something that could save others. When the act passed and was signed into law, the family stood together at the Capitol. The bill mandated over 200 hours of training for every 911 operator in Florida, established strict transfer protocols, created real accountability for system failures. "Every operator trained under this law that's Denise still saving lives," Rick said quietly. Nathan nodded. "She made sure we caught him. Now she's making sure it doesn't happen to someone else."
Appeals are done and everything is over.
On June 22nd,
we don't need this
2002,
evidence anymore,
Karen
and I was
visits her
very
boyfriend
happy
John
to be able to
in
release
Cardiff
that to
for the
him.
day.
There it is.
According to
This is the
Karen,
ring
they
that she
both
had.
decided to
The law carried her name now, enshrined in Florida statutes forever. But as Nathan left the Capitol that day, he knew legislation wasn't the only way to keep her voice alive. There was still more work to do, more people to reach, more lives to change. Her story was just beginning to spread beyond Florida's borders. The first training session started at 8 a.m. in a Tampa conference room, 3911 dispatchers, learning protocols that might have saved Denise's life. Nathan stood at the front. The Denise Amber Lee Foundation logo projected behind him. Rick sat ready to walk through the technical failures. The curriculum they'd built turned every missed opportunity from that January day into a training scenario operators would never forget. "Every operator in this room, you're learning from her case," Nathan said. "You're learning what she needed that day and didn't get." The sessions covered everything: how to handle witness calls reporting kidnappings in progress, when to transfer immediately versus when to dispatch, what it sounds like when someone is leaving clues while pretending to talk to their abductor. Jane Kowalski's highway call became the template for what immediate action looked like. We trained them on missed transfers, on taking witness calls seriously, on understanding that the voice on the line might be the only chance someone has, Rick explained. The Foundation's work spread nationwide. Hundreds of sessions, thousands of operators learning from Denise's case, carrying her story into every shift they worked. Amanda made a choice that surprised no one who knew her. She became a 911 dispatcher herself, trained under the protocols the Foundation had established. Every call she answered was a tribute to her sister. "I answer the calls now. Every one," Amanda said. "I make sure what happened to Denise doesn't happen on my watch." She worked the night shift, the chaotic hours when emergencies came fast. Every time a witness called reporting something strange, Amanda listened with the attention that came from knowing what a missed call could cost. "She's the reason I know what to listen for. She's the reason I understand how much a single call matters." Years passed. The ring sat in evidence storage throughout King's appeals, just a piece of silver in a plastic bag. When they finally returned it to Nathan, he held it and thought about the moment she'd slipped it off, knowing exactly what it meant. Knowing they'd find it. Noah and Adam grew up hearing their mother's story. Not just what happened to her, but what she did. How she fought. How she thought like a cop. How she solved her own murder while it was still happening. The foundation had trained operators in 42 states. The Denise Amber Lee Act remained Florida law. Her name embedded in every training manual, every protocol rewritten because of what the system had failed to do for her. Michael King sits on death row. He'd thought he'd erased her, covered his tracks, made her disappear without witnesses or evidence. But she was in the back seat with her phone, dialing 911. Under the duct tape, with her hair pulled out by the roots. In a call he never knew was real, leaving clues in every word. Every trace he tried to hide, she made sure they'd find. He tried to make her disappear. Instead, Denise Amber Lee became impossible to forget. Her name on a law, a foundation. In the voices of dispatchers who answer calls across the country, every trace he couldn't take back. She left deliberately, her final act of defiance, her ultimate victory. Denise Amber Lee's story reminds us that courage doesn't always look like escape. Sometimes it looks like leaving evidence in the hope that justice will follow. Her father trained her well. She thought like a cop because she was raised by one. And in her final hours, she used everything he taught her to make sure Michael King couldn't walk away. The ring she slipped off her finger, the hair she pulled out by the roots, the 911 call where she left clues in every word. Every piece of evidence was deliberate. Every choice was strategic. She knew what investigators would need, and she made absolutely certain they'd have it. Her legacy lives on in the Denise Amber Lee Act, training thousands of 911 operators across the country. Her sister Amanda answers emergency calls every day, carrying forward the mission Denise couldn't complete. Her sons Noah and Adam grew up knowing their mother was a hero who solved her own murder. That's what remains when a life is taken. The impact, the change, the people who refuse to let that voice go silent. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment below. What about Denise's story will stay with you? Share this with someone who needs to hear it. These stories matter because the people in them mattered. Thank you for listening. This story is based on the real case of Denise Amber Lee. Some scenes have been dramatized for storytelling, but the facts and her incredible bravery remain true. My deepest respect to her family and everyone who continues to honor her memory.